Well, it's a great pleasure for me today to introduce Benjamin Mills, but before I actually say something about Benjamin, I first want to say something about Bob Berner, so Robert Berner. Bob Berner was a professor at Yale University after getting a PhD in geology from Harvard, and in 2017, his colleagues and friends and old students got together and decided to establish this honorary lectureship. And this was to commemorate Bob's intellectual legacy, but also to recognize mid-career scientists like Benjamin Mills. And Bob was an inspiration to many people. He had a huge impact on the field, and I didn't know him personally, but you can see on the slide that he really touched a lot of people in their work and also in their, let's say, personally. And what I can say is that I think a lot of people have copied Bob Berner's research approach, taking a combination of experiments, field observations, and mathematical modeling to answer clear, insightful questions in the field. And he also wrote a couple of very, very influential textbooks, one being a citation classic, Early Diagenesis, and I think that book stimulated a lot of people actually to do work in this field, and this was the case for myself, but I think this holds for a lot of people, and a lot of people also have used the book Global Environment in their classes, and that's a book that he wrote together with his wife, Elizabeth Berner. Some of Bob's major contributions, there were many, many contributions, but three that I'd like to mention here. First of all, the use of first principles from chemical kinetics and thermodynamics to identify and quantify chemical processes in surface environments. The other one, the increased understanding, or let's say, big impacts on understanding how plants and organisms increase rates of chemical weathering. There will actually be a plenary on this week. And then finally, modeling of the Earth system through geological time with the BLAG and geocarb models. And this brings me directly to Ben's work, because Ben started out as a mathematician and started working with the geocarb model and has built on that, and over the past 10 years has really transformed the field of biogeochemical modeling. And so we're very pleasured that Ben is willing to give this lecture here today, very honored by that, and I'd like to welcome Ben on the stage to actually give the lecture and also receive the certificate.
All right. Hi. Thank you, everyone, for coming. Thank you so much to the colleagues who nominated me for this award, to the panel who decided to give me the award, for the session conveners who have let me crash their session to come and give this talk. It's a real honor to get any kind of award, but something so directly linked to Bob Berner, it's a real honor for me, because as you'll see in the talk I'm about to give, Bob's directly inspired almost all of the work that I've been doing. So what am I going to talk about? I'm going to give a little brief intro of who I am, how did I get here. I'm going to mostly talk about where my group have taken Bob's famous geocarb modeling approach. I'm going to do a little bit on what we've learned about biosphere stability over time. So that is the focus of this wider session, so trying to keep it a bit topical with the rest of the session. And then I want to talk a little bit about current problems and future solutions. So what do we still need to improve in these kind of models? What sort of stuff can all of us do, not just the modelers out there, to try and answer these questions better in the future? Okay, so 2008. I am a mathematics graduate. I've done a master's in maths. I want to do a PhD. I want to do research. But as you can hopefully tell from this picture, I was a massive hippie. So I didn't want to go into banking, which is what most of my mathematical colleagues were doing. I didn't really want to go into mathematical research. I wanted to do something about the Earth, the global environment. I wanted to sort of save the world one way or another. I didn't quite know how. But fortunately, I was already here at UEA Norwich, which, if you don't know, is kind of a hippie university in the UK. And that's where I ran into Andy Watson, a professor who is known for a lot of things, but one of the things he was best known for is his work on the Gaia hypothesis. So he was a student of Jim Lovelock, and Andy and Jim developed a model called Daisy World. And this was the first ever computer model that established that a planet's biosphere can regulate the temperature of a planet. So the idea in the Gaia hypothesis is that you can imagine the planet and the biosphere as kind of a single self-regulating system. So I enthusiastically went to do this PhD with Andy, not really knowing what I was getting myself in for. And the first thing that Andy did was to share with me these 3 papers. So these are 3 papers. They're all in American Journal of Science, and they're all written by Bob Berner. So this is BLAG, Berner, de Saga, and Garrels, the BLAG model. 1983, so this was probably the first real application of a dynamical model of Earth's carbon cycle over proper long geological time. So it was 100 million years of carbon cycle modeling, and it was probably the first ever model that made a reasonable prediction that CO2 fell over this time that kind of agreed with the proxy records. The second paper, Berner, 1987, this was about the sulfur cycle, the carbon cycle, and how they work together to regulate Earth's oxygen cycle. Again, another really hugely important piece of work that we all sort of know as canon today in geochemistry, how those cycles work. And the third paper was Berner 91, which is the geocarb model. So this was the first dynamical model for the carbon cycle over the entire Phanerozoic eon. And these were the first scientific papers I ever actually read, because when you study mathematics, you don't really read papers, you don't read literature in the same way. So this was an incredible introduction to geochemistry and to biogeochemical modeling. And I came out of this thinking, you know, number one, this guy, Berner, has this really figured out. Like, these papers laid out so well how all of this stuff worked. And then number two, that AJS is the best journal in the world. So this is geocarb. It is a wonderfully simple system where you have the atmosphere and ocean carbon, so that's all the carbon dioxide that exists in the atmosphere, and all of the carbon-related ions that exist in the ocean as a single box. And then you have all the carbon buried as carbonates, like limestones in the sediments, and you have all the carbon buried as organic matter in the sediments. And the proposition of this model was that if you can figure out the fluxes that transfer carbon between the ocean atmosphere system and the sediments, then you can figure out how much CO2 has lived in the atmosphere throughout very long periods of time. This was much simpler than previous approaches, but it worked really very well. And principally what you had to work out were the things on the left here, which are the CO2 sources, which are largely related to volcanism and magmatic degassing. And then you have the CO2 sinks that are largely related to either biological activity, which is taking CO2 and fixing it as organic matter, or weathering reactions like silicate weathering, which are taking CO2 out of the atmosphere, dissolving it in rainwater, and eventually precipitating carbonates in the ocean. And this model attempted to figure out how much CO2 is coming up through degassing, how much is being buried through weathering and biological productivity. And it enabled Berner to make plots like this, which is Phanerozoic estimates of CO2, so 550 or so million years of CO2. And these estimates still broadly hold true today. You know, we have more proxy records than we did, but they generally follow a lot of these patterns. You have a high CO2 warm Paleozoic era. At the end, towards the end of the Paleozoic, you drop into the Paleozoic Ice Age with lower CO2. You then have high CO2 again through the Mesozoic when it was warm, and dropping again into the Cenozoic era where we are now, where it's an Ice Age once again. So these were fantastic predictive plots of how CO2 varied over time. So what did I do? So that modeling all existed when I began my PhD, and I started working not necessarily with geocarb, but with a model called COPS. So COPS stands for carbon, oxygen, phosphorus, sulfur evolution. And most of it is the same as geocarb. So this picture on the left here that shows the blue and red arrows and the square stuff, that is just basically the same diagram from geocarb. It shows how you have the carbon cycle and the sulfur cycle working together to regulate atmospheric oxygen. So what we added to geocarb in COPS was the thing that appears on the right, which is a nutrients and productivity cycle. So the idea was that we would have nitrate and phosphorus reservoirs on the ocean, we would have phosphorus weathering on the land, and instead of, like Berner did it in the geocarb model, he used isotope records to infer how much carbon is buried, how much pyrite sulfur is buried. In the COPS model, we took the approach that we would use a dynamic nutrient system to do that instead. So the models are very similar, but the geocarb model was probably better at making predictions of what actually happened, whereas the COPS model was better at testing hypotheses about maybe what happens if we put more nutrients in through weathering. But ultimately, the models gave fairly similar predictions. So these are some long-term CO2 predictions from geocarb and from COPS, and they both showed fairly similar trends. So these are two fairly similar models with some slight differences between them. So one thing I was very interested in is something I'm calling the timescale complexity problem, which is that the modeling approach on the right here, which is in geocarb, it's in COPS, it's called a box model. So these are very simplified models where you have all the CO2 living in a box and all of something else living in a different box, and you have arrows and fluxes between the boxes. So you're not necessarily simulating anything that looks like a planet, right? It's a bunch of buckets or bathtubs. Whereas the real Earth doesn't look like that, right? It has spatial dimensions, it has weather, it has oceans, bathymetry, mountains, etc. So the real Earth looks more like something on the left, which is a proper 3D Earth system model. Now the problem is if you want to build a proper 3D Earth system model and run it for geological time, you run into this problem, that your computer is just not fast enough to do it. So complicated 3G Earth system biogeochemical models, they can only really be run for thousands of years. You can't run one for millions or for billions of years, which is why Berner and others typically use these box models. Now, what I wanted to do as somebody coming from a mathematics background is to try and go somewhere in the middle here, to try and make a model that had spatial representations of things like the climate and the ocean, but was also able to run for multi-million year timeframes in order to address some of these questions about how does the planet work, how does it cool, how does it get hot, for example. So this is the kind of thing we came up with. So this is our model. It is called SCION, which means Spatial Continuous Integration. SCION is also a British word for the descendant of a noble family, and I think that's quite a nice apt name for it, given where the model's heritage comes from the geocarb models. And what this model does is it combines a 3D steady state general circulation climate, so it has a 3D climate of a type. It has a 2D land surface with vegetation, with weathering reactions, and at the moment it still has a one-box bathtub ocean. So, you can't have everything at the moment, but it does some things. The way this works is by taking this large data structure. So you're supposed to look at the thing at the top here, which is those little sources. You run a traditional climate model for a bunch of different CO2 levels, and you run it for a lot of different time points throughout Earth history. And then you can take all of those results, all of those different climates, and you can make a big sort of lookup table. And that means that your biogeochemical box model, when it's cycling away over millions or billions of years, as long as it knows where it is in time and how much CO2 is in the atmosphere, it can go to this big data structure and it can estimate what the climate looks like. And this gets you around this problem of having to run a very computationally expensive global climate model that could take you weeks or months just to reach a solution. Now, there is, of course, a problem when you do this, which is that continents change over time. So, of course, you have a supercontinent, and then if you go 10 or 20 million years in the future, it might begin to break up. It might turn into dispersed continents. So if you want a model to actually do this, you have to figure out a way to merge your continents over time. And this is what we use a neural network for. So this is a type of machine learning. It's called a deep convolution neural network. And it's something that's used in the movie industry to increase the frame rate in films. So the data set on the left here is our selection of paleoclimate model runs at different points in time and at different CO2 levels. And what you're seeing in the middle is the process of finding an intermediate frame. So if you imagine a movie where somebody is standing like this, and then you imagine they're standing like this, the intermediate frame is where they're standing like this in the middle. So it makes that motion between here and here. And that's exactly what we want to do. So you can do this with an algorithm. It looks at a picture of climate. It looks at all different kind of resolutions of that image at different parts of the image. It then multiplies these by random numbers and tries to come up with some sort of answer. Now, of course, the first time it does this, it looks like absolute trash, but then you train the model on thousands and thousands of hours of movies, and it slowly gets better and better, and now these algorithms are actually fantastic. So here is an example on the right-hand side of the algorithm that we used. So this was developed in partnership with Google. It's used widely through the movie industry, and this is taking two separate pictures and creating what's called an optical flow, a movement between them. So We're using the same capability here to take different snapshots of climate and make them flow into each other. So this gets around the problem of having to run a climate model for tens of millions of years. We can use optical flow in order to make that transition happen as naturally as we can. So this is the model we end up with. The top left-hand side here will show you our little continents moving around. You can see our little terrestrial biosphere is living and dying and shifting around its productivity. The middle panel here shows the temperature of the surface, and the right-hand panel shows the continental runoff, very important for weathering. And you can see here that this is a model that is running over the entirety of the Phanerozoic in the time that I just took to say that. So it's relatively quick to run, and the model is doing everything in a self-consistent way. So the only thing we are telling the model is where the tectonic plates are and how fast they are all moving around. Everything else, so the amount of CO2 coming out of subduction zones, the chemical cycling, the biosphere, it's all inferred within the model. So it becomes a very useful tool for trying to ask ourselves, how does the Earth function? How does this long-term CO2 concentration change? Why does the temperature change? And I've not got time today to really talk about the CO2 predictions of this model. I hope you can see they're broadly not too bad, those of you who know about Phanerozoic CO2. But we can use it to do all sorts of fun stuff and estimate why temperature change happens, why oxygen change happens, and lots of other things like that. But today I want to talk a bit about what we can do with this model in terms of biosphere stability. Because having a model that is spatially resolved on the land surface, this lets us run a vegetation model. It lets us have a really detailed look at how plants impact climate and how climate impacts plants. So this is our vegetation model, which is called the Fast Land Occupancy and Reaction Algorithm, or FLORA, which is, I think, one of the better acronyms that we've come up with. This vegetation model lives within each of the grid cells of our larger model. And this little loop is showing that on every time step of our model, we generate a climate. The climate then goes through to the vegetation model, which decides where the vegetation is going to grow, how much carbon it's going to store, what it's going to do with its carbon and its allocation. Then that goes back into a map of the productivity, a map of the organic carbon export, and a map of the weathering enhancement from vegetation. And then that goes back into our long-term model. So we can simulate this feedback between plants expanding and moving to different areas, how that might impact the carbon cycle, how that might then impact the climate, which will then feed back onto where the plants can live. So here is an example of some model outputs from here. This is just snapshots of our model. If you move up the column, you're going from the Triassic through to the present day. And what you can see here on the left-hand side column is that as the model is going through time, the plants are living in different places. So they're living largely in the equator at the mid-high latitudes, but depending on the shape of the continents and depending on the CO2 level, they're shifting about where they can live. And that is changing things like the weathering enhancement, it's changing the organic carbon cycle, it's changing everything about the model climate. And broadly, our conclusions from this work, if you look at the top plot here, you'll see the green line is our new model with the vegetation. The purple dashed line that I hope you can just about make out is what happens when we don't include the spatial vegetation. And what you can see if you look at the Jurassic period, which is about 20% of the way in from the left, you can see that with the vegetation, the model runs a lot hotter and it has higher CO2. And this is because Pangaea is quite arid, so there are not as many places that vegetation can live. So in the simpler approach that we used to use in models like COPS and models like GeoCarb, we might assume that in the Mesozoic, you had a hot climate, you had quite a lot of runoff, you'd have a productive biosphere. But of course, if you have large bits of aridity on your supercontinent, then you can have a productive biosphere some places, but you can't expand that biosphere productivity across the whole of the land surface. So our conclusion from this paper is that this geographic range of plants is a very important thing when we think about controlling CO2 and silicate weathering. So it's not just about how big your terrestrial biosphere is, it's about where it can live and how far it can expand across the land surface. So taking the other side of that argument, we were interested in what happens when biospheres contract. So this is an example of the Permo-Triassic extinction run in a similar model with a slightly different kind of vegetation model, one that's allowed to adapt and one that is allowed to disperse in response to extinction. And you can see here what is really quite interesting. So we're simulating an input of CO2, so as you might have had from the Siberian traps at the Permo-Triassic, a huge injection of CO2 into the system. Now, what happens with this model when you inject the CO2 is that it overwhelms the tropical biosphere's capacity for adaptation. So it gets too hot and it gets too dry for plants to live in the tropics. So I hope you can see here that we start with this vegetated tropics, and as soon as this CO2 input happens, the vegetation is all removed. Now, what this does is this changes the carbon cycle dramatically. Without that carbon burial in the tropics, without that enhancement of rainfall and enhancement of silicate weathering in the tropics, we have much less carbon drawdown overall. So the model tends to have higher CO2. And what you end up with is not a warming spike that then goes back down. You end up with a warming spike that goes up, and then as the plants die, it goes even higher, and then it doesn't go down for a very, very long time. So in this model, it takes about 5 million years for the biosphere to slowly recolonize the tropics. And this is because it becomes far too hot for anything to live there. So the plants have to disperse and adapt their way back to living there. Now, this is, of course, just a theoretical result. This is something that comes out of a model. It's something that's potentially very interesting, potentially also quite concerning for the present day when you think about the Amazon rainforest, for example. So we also wanted to see how reasonable this was when you look at the fossil record. So what you're seeing here is our attempt to reconstruct where terrestrial biospheres, where vegetation was living through this extinction event in the Permo-Triassic. So on the left-hand side here, if you work your way again up through time, you're seeing the plant fossil record, which is rather sparse. So we've updated this and added the record of tetrapods, so things that might be eating plants, to try and decide if those are there. They're probably also plants. We've also used in the third column these climate-sensitive lithologies, so things like evaporites or coals, to try and tell us what kind of biome we might be in. And putting all of this stuff together, we've tried to define these paleobiomes on the right-hand side, and then we've tried to understand how productive those might have been by comparison to modern-day plants. So there's quite a lot of inference there, but we've done our best to make an independent map of what we think the vegetation was doing through this extinction event. So if you look at the right-hand column here, you can see there's quite a green map on the bottom right, which is before the extinction, and then after the CO2 degassing event, you have a much more pale map with almost nothing at the tropics. And it does seem to take a very long time for the biosphere to re-establish. So again, I haven't put the numbers on here, but you have about 5 million years between the extinction and the re-establishment of the tropical biosphere. So the final piece of this puzzle was putting this biosphere into our model to see if this could actually recreate what happens with temperature and maybe some other isotopic proxies through the extinction. So this figure here shows, now going from left to right, it shows what happens if we tell the model, instead of using its own interactive biosphere, you have to have the plants that were there due to the fossil record. So we're forcing it with the fossil plants. And we can see what happens here. If we just input the CO2, but without changing the plants, we get what's shown in the dashed line. So you can see this white dashed line, hopefully, which on the bottom plot is temperature. It goes up, it comes back down again. And then the green line is what happens, the fat green line, if you have this fossil plant biosphere. So the temperature goes up, and then it keeps going up. And it stays up for a very long time, because you fundamentally change the carbon cycle when you've removed all of these plants. And then finally, once the fossil maps tell us that the plants have re-established, that's when we're able to stabilize the climate system. So we think this model is able, with this fossil plant data set, to reproduce the magnitude and the duration of this crazy extinction event, where everything did apparently stay very, very hot for a very, very long time. So, of course, this blue thing here is the actual temperature record from the proxies. So some conclusions from that piece of work. This habitable area for vegetation is a really important factor in regulating planetary temperature, CO2 levels over deep time. And this is the kind of thing that you wouldn't be able to look at without one of these spatially resolved models. So it's not just about numbers and how much biomass you have, it's about where it is able to live, and almost about how much of the surface of the planet is able to be biogeochemically active. The loss, on the counter side of that is the loss of tropical plant habitats could lead to a destabilizing feedback, something you might call a tipping point. So if you have a period in Earth history where you're able to remove a lot of the vegetation biosphere, then in this kind of spatial model, you can really change the carbon cycle. And the final point, I guess, is we think this is quite consistent with what happens in the Permo-Triassic. So the models on the fossil record kind of support this very long recovery time of vegetation, this very long period of warm climate following the Permo-Triassic mass extinction. So those are some conclusions. Those are some things we're doing with this modeling approach. I hope you find that kind of thing interesting. What I want to move on to now is the things that we are not doing and the things that we're getting wrong. I think I've got a couple of minutes left. Yeah, 5. Okay, great. Loads of things we're doing wrong. So this is a paper you're seeing here. I was fortunate enough to be involved with a couple of years ago now, where we tried to get an understanding of how much organic carbon is being buried in the ocean. So this figure on the left shows all of these ocean drilling cores, and we made estimates of the accumulation rate of organic carbon in each of them, and then we tried to map these onto biogeochemical provinces, which are what you're seeing shown by these colorful shapes. And we tried various different ways to define these provinces. And what you tend to get, if you look over the neogene, which is the figure on the right now, is this white line, which shows you have this big decrease in organic carbon burial, and then an increase again. The yellow dashed line here shows a mass balance model that predicted a similar thing. However, the other lines, the green line, the pink line, these are what we get out of our long-term biogeochemical models. So these are the predictions of geocarb, the predictions of COPS, and also the prediction of the SION model follows quite similar trend. So we're getting this, if you believe the record we have from the marine sediments, we're getting this completely wrong. So in the model, when it gets warmer over the mid-Miocene, which is sort of a long-term warming event, in the model, it responds by burying more carbon, okay? It gets hotter, you've got more weathering, more productivity, you can bury more carbon. It's a negative feedback, a stabilizing feedback. But it appears in the real world that's not how it works. The carbon burial actually decreases, so you have a positive feedback that would reinforce the warming. So I think a major thing that we need to do better in these models is to start mapping out the marine system in a spatial way in the same way that we've been doing with the terrestrial system. So that will let us leverage these kind of records where we have marine maps of organic carbon burial, and let us try and address hypotheses like this that could be really influencing how we understand the system, and certainly the response to warming over long time frames. So some ways to do this is to emulate 3D ocean models. This is something we're trying to start doing. It's a bit more difficult than emulating in 2D because the ocean is a depth as well as an X and Y coordinate. But we're trying to do it, but something that everybody can help with is mapping geochemical and paleobiological data sets onto continental maps. So we often like to look at things as lines through time, but to sort of leverage these new modeling approaches, we really want to start looking at things spatially as well. So, where is the marine anoxia? Where are things living? These questions are really important. So the more data sets we can produce where we map things out spatially as well as through time is going to be really important for answering these questions. And then a linked point to that is establishing uncertainty and consensus in plate tectonic and paleogeographic reconstructions. So there are more and more reconstructions becoming available now for where the continents used to be. Now, when you go into the Paleozoic or further back in time, the agreement between these reconstructions is terrible. They are all over the place. So if you are thinking things might be low latitude samples or high latitude samples, that's very dependent on your plate tectonic and your paleogeographic framework. So this is something that we should probably all work on. We should try and get at least uncertainties established about paleolatitude of different continents over time, at least so we know how much error we might be looking at. So I think that's all I have. I want to thank all my group and collaborators for helping me with all this incredible work, especially to Dongyu, to Kushbu, to Zhen, and to Yulian, who were the people, the wonderful researchers who worked on the work that I've actually shown you today. Lots of stuff about our group is at our Earth Evolution Modeling website. And I have a couple of things to plug to you quickly. We're running a conference in London next week called Life and Planet. It's all about co-evolution of life on the Earth. This is a yearly event. It's always in London in mid-July. So if you're going to be in London, please come and check it out. And secondly, we have a cost action that is similarly in this area. It's called biogeodynamics. So anything that links tectonics and the deep Earth, paleogeography, degassing fluxes to life and the biosphere. If you're interested in those questions, then this is a cost action that can support you in Europe. You can join it for free at biogeodynamics.com, and we have a budget we can spend on networking events, and if you're early career, maybe it will send one of you to this meeting in a few years' time, or to EGU, or to somewhere else. So that's everything. Thank you so much again, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the session.
We have time for maybe one question, one quick one. Yes.
Let's go with this. Hi, Ben. Congratulations, and thanks for a great talk. I'm particularly interested in the vegetation simulations that you have been working on, because I think a lot about present-day and future climates these days, and vegetation is one of slow feedback.
Yes.
that predicts, our future climate response, but has a lot of uncertainty. And it sounds like it's part of the carbon cycle that you're looking at, but I wonder if you look at their albedo, like impacts, and also the biogenic aerosols produced from terrestrial vegetation. And if not, I think whether you have any plans, I think it would be really cool to do that in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's a great question, right? So those direct climate feedbacks between the vegetation and the climate, those are very difficult to do in our approach because the way we use steady state climate model outputs, in each one of those we have to decide what the surface of the planet looks like. So if you change those surface fluxes, those surface properties, we're not able to reflect that in our climate emulator. What we are hoping is with better machine learning algorithms and more of a pivot to getting real machine learning computational experts on board, that we can try and work that sort of thing into these emulators to try and work those direct effects of vegetation. I would love to work on that more, because it's really important and it's something we're not able to do very well.
Thank you, Benjamin.